Hello, I'm Andy Oakley on New Zealand Issues. Today's issue, why do we have racist legislation in New Zealand? Racist, the word everyone loves to use. But I find the use of that word fascinating because I'm firmly in the scientific camp that there's no such thing. Perhaps the largest scientific research project ever conducted, the Human Genome Project, demonstrated that as far as science goes, race simply does not exist. You'd expect then that the schools in New Zealand would teach this vitally important information about how their students fit into the world as individuals. And you might also expect that the concept would flow through the education system onto the workplace and be the cornerstone of our wonderful democracy. A democracy in which each individual has equal rights, just as it states in Article 3 of our Treaty of Waitangi. Of course, I bet you I got halfway through that last sentence and the penny would have dropped for most New Zealanders. Actually, what happens is the minute our children enter the archaic education system in New Zealand, they are quickly categorised as either Maori or non-Maori. This occurs because the Treaty of Waitangi is one of the 8 principles in the New Zealand education system. Specifically, on page 9 of the curriculum, it states, "The curriculum acknowledges the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi and the bicultural foundations of Aotearoa New Zealand. All students have the opportunity to acquire knowledge of Te Reo Maori Mina Ona Tikanga." A similar situation exists in the health sector and just about every other sector there is. If you wish to keep your jobs in these sectors, you are forced to acknowledge the special place Maori and their wonderful culture have in New Zealand society, as if somehow they are different from the rest of us and live in some different kind of culture. Surely if it happens in New Zealand, it could only be New Zealand culture. This has all come about because of the introduction of the Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975. Now this act tells us that Queen Victoria and the Maori people of New Zealand entered into a treaty on February 6, 1840. Maori people are described in the act as follows. Maori means a person of the Maori race of New Zealand and includes any descendant of such a person. So this legislation is like eugenics in reverse. Maori are created out of thin air, as it's now unfashionable to be a New Zealander. Because all of this sounded quite racist to me, and the fact that many of the Maori people I grew up with in Cannons Creek were going backwards socially, I took it upon myself to research this treaty, and I've written a couple of books on the subject. You can Google them if you like. My research uncovered a number of very worrying things, including fraud and an increasing slide into an apartheid system of governance. This is the very thing we were famous for protesting against in the 1980s. And for the sake of our grandchildren, we need to stop this slide immediately. Either the Human Genome Project have got it horribly wrong, or there's no such thing as the Maori race. Now I'm going with science on this, and I suspect the former to be true, which puts all this compulsory Maoriness in our schools, health sectors, local and central government, and our legislation in serious jeopardy. I suspect that the powers that be are onto the fact that that the racist walls are about to come tumbling down, because if one mentions that Maori are not or were not a race, it's labelled as hate speech. That's right. If I repeat a scientific fact and reference the Human Genome Project as evidence, I will be silenced. You don't believe me? Well, I was asked to give a presentation recently on the Foreshore and Seabed Act at Kapiti College. And when the teacher became aware that I may question the very existence of this separate race, my presentation was cancelled and all of my preparation time a complete waste. I was racially bullied on primetime television by Mihirangi Forbes for daring to want equal rights. When a knight of the realm, who had been a pillar of his community, questioned the treaty, he was racially bullied into submission. Nelson Library cancelled a talk on the treaty by Bruce Moon for fear of an uproar. A health and safety risk, they said. On and on it goes. Free speech is not allowed unless it's what the government want to hear. I mean, I see shades of 1930s Germany in my own country. New Zealanders need to understand the truth. There was and is no Maori race living in New Zealand. The term Maori, describing a single or separate group of people, was not even in use when the treaty was signed in 1840. Consequently, Maori people are not even mentioned in the treaty. They couldn't have been. They didn't exist. It was the ignorance about race at the time which allowed for the categorization of all the brown-skinned people who looked similar as one race called Maori. This occurred during the 1840s, not before it. Now, the treaty is clearly addressed to all the people of New Zealand. Kina tangata katoa o Nutarini. I explain this in detail in my book, Once We Were One, The Fraud of Modern Separatism. The people of New Zealand were simply known as New Zealanders. They were made up of 600 or so separate tribes. And when I say separate, I mean many looked different, quite different from each other. Most of the early explorers wrote that there were 3 kinds of different people in New Zealand, some as white as the European sailors. Now, no one knows for sure which of these tribes arrived first, or that earlier tribes or earlier types of people may have been exterminated or intermarried into the population, and neither should it matter one iota, except that the racist legislation, the Treaty of Waitangi Act, 1975, creates people of the Maori race from thin air and attributes them all manner of rights and privileges. Successive governments have pandered to ever more fanciful claims of oppression by these modern-day Western snowflakes masquerading as Maoris. Because successive governments have simply crumbled to the racist demands by these treatyists, their wildly fanciful claims that Maori were treated no better than dogs has actually become our new history. Yet the New Zealanders were found in the process of genocide before there was any substantial European intervention in the early 1800s. And today, they live better than 99.999% of any human that ever lived. And as I explained earlier, they and their culture, which is remarkably like Western culture, value your family and respect authority, etc., are placed on a pedestal in New Zealand, where all non-Maori are classed as second-class citizens. So unfortunately, the answer as to why we have racist legislation in New Zealand is because we have racist legislation. Either that act and all racial policies in New Zealand must be repealed, or science must come up with a new definition for the Maori race, and we need a referendum which clearly allows us the choice as to whether we want to be a racist country or not. I've been Andy Oakley. Noho ora mai.